Our speaker is going to have a microphone on her, but I don't have one. Can you hear me? Everyone can hear me? Okay. So I want to welcome everyone here tonight. Thank you for coming out. Can't believe that it's November and we're entering the holiday season. Everyone's so busy, but we have a wonderful speaker here tonight, and she also has her books for sale. So after the program, if you'd like to, meet her, read her, and look at her books, they're right there for everybody to peruse. So we begin with that. I also like to mention our members. We all have beautiful new name tags for everyone. They're on lanyards so that we don't have to, put pins in our clothes. And so all the people who are paid members have a new name tag. And this way we can greet people and the name is nice and large. But after you wear them, after tonight's program, please take them and put them back on the table so that we have them for next month. I'd like to say that we had a fantastic summer at the Pioneer House and Blacksmith Shop, and it ended in a grand finale in October. The town asked us if we would be open one more week because they were having their Harvest Festival. We were not prepared for the deluge of children coming in costumes. They were trick-or-treating. We had the house decorated for fall, but nothing like, we could do for next year when they have it again. So that was a great event. Everybody had fun. I even had to stand at the door and say, wait, there are so many people going through the house. So that was, really exciting for me, and which leads me to the next event, which is our December open house. That's in conjunction with the tree lighting ceremony and menorah lighting ceremony at a gazebo. After the chorus sings, they go out and they light the lights. And the people are welcome to come through the Pioneer House and the Blacksmith Shop. We'll have the house decorated and we'll serve refreshments of cookies and cider. We do need people to donate cookies for that event. So if you are willing, if you would like to donate, they can either be home baked or store purchased. We will be there at the house to collect cookies on the date, which is, I wrote it down, December, it's the first Sunday of December. Let's see, December 3rd, December 3rd, Sunday afternoon. We'll have the house open from 3:30 to 5:30. But if you have cookies, you could drop them off at 2 o'clock. If there's any problem with, doing that, just see me afterwards. But a lot of people, usually around 100 people stream through for that event. So that would be great. We also are going to decorate the house on November 16th. So if there are any people who enjoyed that aspect of, volunteerism, you can help us decorate the house for the holidays. So I think that is all that I have. Just if members, if you didn't see your name with the name tag, it's just that maybe the dues are in arrears. So if you haven't paid your dues, please see the people at the table over there for the following year. I just want to say that next month we have Joe Struble, who's going to do a presentation on pinpoint photography. He was a curator at the George Eastman House. His specialty was daguerreotypes and tintypes and photos. So it really should be an interesting program. He has spoken at the George Eastman Museum, and he's a personal friend of mine, so I really hope that we have a good turnout for that. So thank you very much. And now I will introduce tonight's speaker. Fran was the executive director of the Monroe County Fair and Recreation Association from 1992 to 2012. She will share the challenges she faced as the first woman to hold the position of executive director in the fair's 169-year history. She was also one of the few women to hold that position in the country. Fran made a number of changes to the existing county fair structure, and the Monroe County Fair became one of the most innovative fairs in New York State. Her book will be available for purchase for $19.39, which includes tax. And please note, refreshments will be served after the program. They're in the back there. And our sign-up sheets for cookies and decorating is at the table. So thank you very much. Enjoy the program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. I always enjoy talking about the fair. You know, there's a saying. Can everybody hear me? No. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. There's a saying that if you find a job you love, you'll never work a day in your life. Some people say it was Confucius that said it. Some people say it was Mark Twain. It depends on which internet site you believe. But whoever said it, I was lucky enough to have that job, that of executive director of the Monroe County Fair and manager of the Dome Center, which the Fair Association owned and operated. I held that job for 20 years. And when I retired in 2012, I felt a real sense of loss, almost a mourning process. So since writing has always been a way for me to get myself out of the doldrums, I decided to write a book about the unusual career of a fair manager. The humorous things that happened that didn't actually seem very humorous at the time, and the vast array of people that I met along the way. Carnival workers, entertainers, politicians, construction workers, business people, and just plain folk who loved the community building aspect of the county fair that's been at the heart of county fairs all over America. I never thought anybody would read the book. I thought I was writing it just for myself and for my sisters who lived in California to let them know what the heck I'd been doing for the last 20 years. But I sent it to an editor that I'd been working with on another project, and I said, "Do you think anybody would be interested in reading this?" And she said she loved it. She laughed and smiled through the whole thing, and she encouraged me to send it out. So I did, and 97 queries later, I found a publisher for it. If you heard a sound you couldn't identify back in July of 2021, that was me screaming when I first saw it as an Amazon book selection. But what was even more exciting was seeing it on the bookshelf at Barnes & Noble. I keep going back there just to see it on the shelf and to count how many are still there from the last time. But security is beginning to look at me kind of suspiciously, so I think I'm going to have to buy something pretty soon.
Buy the book.
So tonight I want to do a couple of things. I want to start out by reading a couple of chapters in my book, just to give you a sense of what the daily life of a fair manager was. And then I want to talk a little bit about the importance of fairs to their community, and then the history of fairs and carnivals, and then finally the history of our own Monroe County Fair. So I want to begin with the prologue. This is to let you know how I was feeling the day after my last fair as manager. It was early, too early to be at the fairgrounds. I had left only a few hours before, the moon already high in its arc across the sky, when I finally closed the door to my hotel room. The hotel was close to the fairgrounds, and I liked being there. It was easier than driving home late at night after the fair closed. I could unwind without thoughts of dirty dishes and unmade beds. When I closed the door, the cacophony of the county fair faded away. I always gave a sigh as the door clicked shut, the quiet embracing me like a warm blanket. But tonight I couldn't sleep. After months of planning layouts, food choices, and entertainment, after hosting thousands of people, some of whom were delightful and others not so much, after a week of smiles, tears, challenges, complaints, wins and losses, the county fair was over. My head was filled with images that ran like a movie reel in my head. This had been my last fair as manager. It was time to retire, time to step back from the history and the pageantry of the fair world and to let a new generation put its mark on the annual event. I stood outside in front of my office. The air was crisp this early in the day, the cool breath of autumn already hovering. Although it was quiet now, I could hear the echo of music from the carousel and the distinctive whooshing of the giant claws it swung, spinning its shrieking occupants, defying death with every terrifying revolution. The ripe aroma of the cattle barn permeated the morning air, and flies buzzed noisily, calling their colleagues to join in the feasting of the rich manure. For a fair manager, there's nothing sadder than the morning after the fair. The food vendors have all pulled in their awnings and hitched up their trailers, already moving on, anticipating their next destinations. The carnival workers, like magicians, have dismantled the rides in only a few hours, so that by morning, all that remains is fair detritus. Stray red cups that roll down the depleted midway like tumbleweed, upended popcorn boxes whose contents are greedily consumed by a flock of seagulls, and a lone balloon still tied to a pole, a gay bit of color in the now barren landscape. I often wondered from where the seagulls came. We were nowhere near the sea. Perhaps they are gypsy birds that follow the carnivals from place to place, knowing there will be good eating in their wake. Only a week ago we scurried, preparing the fairgrounds for our guests. There were flowers to plant, horse arena to till, livestock pens to assemble, tables to set up, permits and licenses to secure, inspections to endure, and tents and flags, signs and decorations to place as we put our best foot forward. We had such high hopes for no rain, like that ever happened, for no scorching heat, for record crowds, for a community event that would be both fun and profitable for everyone. And now it was time to undo everything, to scrub the livestock barns, to sweep and grade and dismantle, to reconcile the books, and finally to evaluate. It was over, the good and the bad. And yet, as I looked out over the fairgrounds that morning, I knew my heart wasn't ready to let it all go. I had 20 years of memories crowding my mind, some happy, some sad, some funny, and some funny only in retrospect. Can you tell how I was feeling that day? Very nostalgic. The next chapter, this is my favorite chapter in the book. It's called The Weather. And when you're doing an outdoor event, the weather is probably the most important thing that you have to consider. Whether the weather be fine, whether the weather be not, whether the weather be cold, whether the weather be hot. Well, whether the weather, whatever the weather, whether we like it or not. That's from an old British tongue twister. When it came to the fair, I obsessed about everything. The problem was that a fair takes on a life of its own, so I had no control over anything. All I could do was roll with the punches, which is not a great option for a control freak. When there are hundreds of cows, sheep, goats, pigeons, and rabbits, anything can and usually does happen. One year, on the night before the fair opened, I went to the livestock barn to find that some of the sheep had escaped from their pens and were busy investigating the building. It's a good thing I had just watched the movie Babe, because the only people available to corral and to get the critters reconfined were 2 flower show superintendents, a farm kid who hated sheep, and me. I pretended I was a sheepdog and ran around in circles, flapping my arms and making barking noises. It was not a pretty sight. Not only were there hundreds of animals to contend with, along with their various uncivilized and unpredictable behaviors, but there were thousands of people, many of whom also had uncivilized and unpredictable behaviors. But the thing I worried about the most was the greatest unpredictable, the weather. And of course, it was the one thing that could make or break a fair. I had good reason to worry about the weather. I lived in an area where the weather was volatile at best. A sunny day with no rain in the forecast would suddenly turn stormy. Since our bad weather usually came from the west, I constantly evaluated the skyscape in that direction. Were those thunder clouds? Why was the sky that sickly black and yellow color? Was it a tornado? We always went to the worst case scenario. Or just a bit of rain. I wish I had been a fair manager in California. It never rains there in the summer. I could have put that worry to rest. In the 20 years I was a fair manager, there was only one year when it didn't rain, and that year it was 100 degrees in the shade. I became absolutely paranoid about the weather, and I think I may actually have been a conduit for rain. One year we were in a severe drought. The only week it rained all spring and summer was Fair Week. I was told that farmers used to time their plantings to Fair Week because they always knew it would rain. This was not encouraging. My paranoia came to a head one year in particular. Setup day was perfect. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. Opening day of the fair was another story. A hurricane had come farther up the East Coast than had been predicted, and we were getting the tail end of it. More rain fell on Monroe County on that one day than had ever previously been recorded. Shortly before the fair was scheduled to begin, I was standing in the beef cattle tent when the skies opened. Forget buckets, the rain came down in bushels. In no time, there were 8 inches of water in the tent. I kept waiting for the rain to stop before I made my escape, but it never did. I always tried to look my best on opening day, especially for the opening ceremony that the press covered. I really didn't want to go on TV looking like a drowned rat. But by the time I made it back to my office from the beef cattle tent, my hair hung in strings. The temporary brown rinse I had put in it that morning was running down my face in rivulets. Think Rudy Giuliani. My clothes were clinging to me like a second skin, and my brand new white sneakers were covered in red clay. Fortunately, the press was busy with the storm, so they didn't bother with the opening ceremony anyway. That was the first day, and things went down the storm drain from there. The weather forecast changed by the minute, usually for the worst, as the storm stalled over our area. Each night I prayed that the next day would dawn bright and shiny. Each morning I woke up to rain and gloom. One morning I was watching the weather on TV as I got dressed. The smiling weatherman said it was going to be a beautiful sunny day. I looked out the window. It was raining. Perhaps it was a pre-recorded weather report. Or perhaps the weatherman was in some unknown enchanted niche where it never rained until after sundown, like Camelot. He sure wasn't where I was. Of course, the weather during the weeks following the fair was perfect. I'd wake up every morning, see the sun shining, and pull the covers over my head. I was heard mumbling several times a day, this would have made a perfect fair week. And of course, the response, you can't do anything about the weather, so stop beating yourself up, just caused me to beat myself up more. But that wasn't the only year that the weather was an issue. During my first fair, a great deal of rain came down in a very short period of time. The storm sewers simply couldn't handle that volume of water, so 2 things happened. First, geysers arose from the storm drains in the dome and in the toilets in the men's bathroom. Quite a surprise, I imagine, if you happened to be using the facilities at the time. Simultaneously, water filled up the midway area so that rides, foods, and games were under about 10 inches of water. Once the rain stopped, nothing happened. The water just sat there. Since it was late in the day on Friday, calling a plumber would have been a financial disaster. I had no choice. I had to call the town supervisor for help, which was not high on my list of fun activities. First of all, he didn't like having the fairgrounds in his town. Secondly, he didn't like me personally because I didn't live in his town. And thirdly, he didn't think I was capable of running the fairgrounds anyways, all of which he told me on numerous occasions. I really did not want to call Mr. Supervisor, but necessity breeds necessity. So I made the call. He was not pleased to hear from me. But to his credit, he saw that I was up a creek without a paddle, quite literally, and he not exactly graciously agreed to send a crew. Also to his credit, he never sent us a bill for services rendered. The crew traced the blockage to the middle of the track's infield, When they flushed the line, they found a drowned groundhog, one of the hundreds who had made his home in tunnels under the track. Once they removed his body from the pipe, water began to flow, and the show went on. Worse than mere rain were the pop-up thunderstorms that seemed to plague us. They were usually accompanied by high winds and dangerous lightning. We always made numerous announcements to get people out of the tents and into buildings before the storms hit. But there were always a few intractable individuals who ignored us. During one such storm, a man insisted on staying in the clam tent. He sat on a metal chair that was not only in a puddle of water, but also next to a metal tent post, which he decided to hold on to. This man was obviously not too bright. When I got word over the radio that someone had been electrocuted in the clam tent, my blood ran cold. I was sure he was dead. Turns out he was fine, only a little tingly. We sent him to the hospital anyway. So you get an idea of what the day-to-day life of a fair manager is, one crisis after another. When you're managing a fair, the organization and the planning are exhilarating. You get to interact with members of the community groups and businesses, pick themes, plan layouts, order supplies, develop media campaigns, shoot commercials, and a whole host of other details that go into making an event that is part of the American landscape. And then comes the actual execution of the plans that have been at the forefront of your mind for a whole year. At that point, you become involved in the nitty-gritty minutia, dealing with complaints, settling disputes, solving problems, and directing all the various pieces that all have to fit together perfectly in order to make an event succeed. Sort of like a giant jigsaw puzzle. And then it's over. It's time to evaluate and start planning for next year. A reporter once asked me how I knew if our fair was a success. I said if it didn't rain, I considered it a success. But I also said that seeing our ideas come to fruition and watching people enjoy themselves was really what I considered a success. But the question got me thinking that I was so involved with the problems and the complaints and the bottom line and the board critiques that I never really had a sense of what the fair meant to our community. That is, until Fair Lady came out. And suddenly I began getting letters and emails and phone calls from people telling me how much the fair meant to them. Some of the people I had known forever, and they never had a kind word to say to me. Some people were strangers who wanted me to know how the fair had benefited themselves and their families. They mentioned how their kids had worked for weeks to prepare their exhibits and of their positive experiences working in the milk barn. One person said that the fair brought joy to the community for an entire generation. Wow, okay, I'll buy that. Another said that the fair made dreams possible and empowered people, showing that each role was important to the success of the whole. Still other non-fair people told me that they never realized how much work went into planning a fair and how they would now view fairs from an entirely different perspective. What came through loud and clear was that the fair was special and a true community celebration that people looked forward to, enjoyed, and benefited from. Before I retired, I was a member of a group of nonprofit executive directors. In this group, the majority of them were from medically related fields like the Kidney Association and the Heart Association and the Association for the Visibly Impaired and the Blind. At those meetings, I always felt like a misfit. They were dealing with finding fundings for research and cure of life-altering diseases, and I ran a fair. I really felt insignificant. But the feedback from my book made me realize that bringing the community together to showcase its businesses, educate about agriculture, celebrate youth and their accomplishments, and simply to enjoy a snapshot of America has a value that can't be calculated. Fairs may not be the cure for cancer, but any event that brings the community together instead of pulling it apart, especially during these divisive times, has a value that can't be calculated. So now that we know how important fairs are to their communities, how did they come to be? The fairs have a very long history. The word fair comes from the Latin word feria, which means feast day or holy day. An early mention of fairs is in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, when fairs were of religious importance and often revenue generators for churches. They spread throughout Europe during the Renaissance, but gradually became social and commercial events rather than religious ones. They were typically located in a central area so that both vendors and patrons could come from all directions to see what was going on at the fair. Entertainers like traveling players and clowns were common. At a fair, visitors could shoe their horses, purchase kitchen supplies, exchange information about the region, and obtain a variety of other needed goods and services, ranging from farmhands to fabrics. With the opening of the sea routes to the east, fair patrons could find luxury items that were rare in Europe, like tea, porcelain, and fine silks. As the New World was settled, a new kind of fair appeared. In 1811, the first recognized American fair was held in, anybody want to guess what state?
Vermont. Virginia.
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, right. In Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Anything of consequence that happened during that time period seemed to happen in either Virginia or Massachusetts. So in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, a gentleman farmer convinced his neighbors to join him in a cattle show. The purpose of those early American fairs was for farmers to show off their prime stock and newest hybrids to other farmers, and also for them to see the newest in agricultural innovations. Eventually, other competitions took place along with cattle, other livestock, and then crops, and then finally some home arts like weaving, sewing, quilting, baking, but still primarily involving farming families who made up the majority of the population. As the country changed from an agrarian society to a manufacturing society, fairs also changed. With only 2% of the population now into farming, people became farther and farther estranged from the sources of their food and fiber. So that instead of fairs being farmer-to-farmer events, they became a chance for the farmer to connect with the consumer, to show them how important agriculture was in their everyday lives. Fairs became a place where non-farm people could see, touch, smell, and taste agriculture. Every one of the 2,000 fairs across North America has the same mission: to provide agricultural information and experiences to the consumer. But in order to do that, you first have to get people to come to your fair. You need a hook. Come to the fair and see a goat show. It doesn't have quite the pizzazz of come to the fair and thrill to the death-defying rides on the Midway. So carnivals and fair entertainment became the hooks to get people into the fair so that they could learn about agriculture. Fairs became edutainment events. But carnivals were not part of those early fairs. In fact, carnivals didn't come about until the late 1800s, early 1900s. The carnival phenomenon actually started at the Chicago World's Fair, also known as the World's Columbian Exposition, in 1893. Buffalo Bill Cody desperately wanted to be part of that fair with his Wild West show. But the organizer of the fair said that the cost of Bill Cody's participation in the fair would be 50% of his gross proceeds, not net, gross. Well, Bill Cody said, no way, or probably something a lot more colorful. So instead, he leased 15 acres of land adjacent to the World's Fair site. He opened his Wild West show 3 weeks before the exposition opened, and over its 7-month run, his company performed for over 5 million people, often hosting more viewers than the exposition. The synergy between the two events was recognized, and that was the start of what would become a partnership between fairs and carnivals. Here's a little bit of trivia for you. The Ferris wheel debuted at the Chicago World's Fair because the fair's organizer wanted to outdo the spectacular Eiffel Tower that had been presented at the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. Carnivals not only are the hooks that get people into the fair, but they also are financial necessities for fairs. At least 25% of a fair's income comes from carnivals that pay rent and ride commissions. Many people don't enjoy the carnival and don't understand the significance of it to the fair. They think a fair can survive as only an agricultural event. Well, the Monroe County Fair tried that after I retired. Attendance plummeted. To this day, carnival people who call themselves show people consider Buffalo Bill Cody to be the father of the carnival business. I had an opportunity to go to a banquet in Las Vegas that the show people have annually. And as the board of directors was introduced, the whole audience stood up, started clapping and singing "There's No Business Like Show Business," which of course is from the Broadway musical Annie Get Your Gun, which is about Buffalo Bill Cody and Annie Oakley. It was really quite moving, actually. I had tears in my eyes. But then again, I'm known to cry at the Star Spangled Banner and Pomp and Circumstance and the Wedding March. So now that you know how fairs originated and how carnivals came to be part of them, I thought we'd talk a bit about the history of our own Monroe County Fair. The first fair in Monroe County occurred in the village of Rochester in 1823 and was organized by the Monroe County Agricultural Society. This makes the Monroe County Fair one of the oldest fairs in New York State, even older than the city of Rochester. The oldest fair in the state, I looked that up today, was the Steuben County Fair that started in 1819. The organization lapsed after that first fair, and the next fair wasn't presented until 1840, so it lapsed for 17 years. From 1840 to 1856, the fair moved around from place to place, including Brockport, Rush, and Edgerton Park. During that time, the Fair Association changed its name several times, first to the Genesee Valley Horticultural Society, then to the Western New York Horticultural Society, and then to the Western New York Agricultural Society. In 1856, the Western New York Horticultural Society selected Brighton as its permanent home. The New York State Fair also used Brighton for that location until 1890, when it made Syracuse the home of the State Fair. The fairgrounds was a large open field called Crittenden Park, about a mile south of Rochester and near the Genesee River. There's some picture there. You might want to take a look at it later. This is how it was described. Giant tree stumps were scattered throughout the field, attesting to how recently the region had been covered with primeval forest. 45 years before, this dense and swampy wilderness had been uninhabited. Now it was hosting two fairs, the Monroe County Fair and the New York State Fair, which alone attracted over 100,000 people, 2/3 of whom were adult males. Just saying. During the Civil War, the fairgrounds, which became known as Camp Hill House, were also used as a training grounds for Rochester Civil War recruits. 3 Civil War units were trained there: the 8th Cavalry, the 105th Infantry, and the 22nd Cavalry. The fairgrounds in Brighton also had a quarter-mile racetrack that earned the reputation of being the fastest track in the East. If you owned a trotting horse in New York State, this was the track that you wanted to compete on. Had you attended any event at the fairgrounds, be it the fair or the races, you would have met the greats of the time: U.S. presidents, mayors, athletes, aviators, and during Women's Day, Susan B. Anthony. The Western New York Agricultural Society continued to hold its event in Brighton until 1905, but they canceled the Monroe County Fair for 9 years between 1895 and 1904. From 1904 to 1946, the fair again moved around the county, including Rush Fireman's Field and Edgerton Park. However, there were no fairs from 1942 to 1944, a casualty of World War II. The fair resumed in 1945 at Edgerton Park, and that year became known as the Victory Fair. In 1947, a 60-acre tract of land was purchased in Henrietta, and the fair once again had a permanent home. I'll read to you from the book. Location, location, location. It's everything if you're running a business. Unfortunately, the location of the Monroe County Fair sucked. It was midway between the two of the biggest fairs in the country, the Erie County Fair in Hamburg and the New York State Fair in Syracuse. If local people thought about the fair, which they rarely did, it was one of those two, not their own county one. The fairgrounds, called the Lot in carnival jargon, was on a 60-acre tract of land in Henrietta, a suburb of Rochester. When the fairgrounds was purchased in 1947, it was in the middle of nowhere. When I was a kid, I remember my family taking Sunday drives to Henrietta because Meisenthal's Dairy, which was located in the town, had the best black raspberry ice cream in the county. It took us a long time to get to Meisenthal's, possibly because my father had no clue how to get there. At the time, there were few residences or businesses in the area, and the land was mostly used for farming. As the years passed, Henrietta grew into a densely populated and highly commercialized town, including the area directly across the street from the fairgrounds. Instead of having cornfields for neighbors, the fairgrounds were now in the center of a residential area. The neighbors did not particularly like living in close proximity to the fairgrounds and continually complained about the noise, smell, traffic, etc. This drove me crazy because we had first dibs. After all, the fairgrounds was there long before any of the houses were built. The fair enjoyed a number of good years following the move to Henrietta. The famous stunt car driver Joey Chitwood debuted in 1952, and he returned every year for decades. In 1955, the fair was described in news stories as 1 mile of thrills, games, rides, skill competitions, animals, and vaudeville shows, including stock car races, Cherokee Indian rodeo, Joey Chitwood, and a drum and bugle competition. In 1959, Gene Autry appeared at the fair. In 1960, Conway Twitty. Then, tawdriness invaded the fair in the 1970s with the arrival of stripper shows.
Yeah.
One woman in the Tahiti burlesque tent was cited for breaking the law, and in 1971, stripper shows were banned from the fair. But this is a great example of if people are talking about you, it's good for business, because attendance soared in the 1970s. By the late 1980s, Henrietta officials began complaining about the appearance and the operation of the fairgrounds, and the fair was on a decline. I became fair as executive director in 1992, at a time when the executive director was at war with the town supervisor. Not a great place to start. And I can't say that it improved greatly no matter what I did to try to fix the problems. By that time, the organization was called the Monroe County Fair and Recreation Association, and its mission was to support youth in agriculture, culminating in the annual celebration of the Monroe County Fair. I had been on the board of directors since 1988 as a liaison to the board from Cornell Cooperative Extension 4-H, where I worked as a program assistant. At that time, 4-H had had a falling out with the fair board and was holding its own youth fair in a separate location, which was detrimental to both the fair and to 4-H. So I asked if I could become a liaison to the fair board in hopes of mending fences and getting 4-H back to their traditional place at the fair. So I will tell you what the board was like at this point. It was the late 1980s, and as I recall, the fair board was comprised of 23 members, 17 men and 6 women, including me. Well, at least I thought I was on the fair board. I started going to meetings and contributing to the discussions, and one day we had to vote on something, so I raised my hand to vote, and somebody said, well, if we're gonna let her vote, we really ought to vote her onto the board first. And so they did, and so that's how I got onto the board. The board president was the chief of police at one of the nearby towns. Most of the men on the board were well into their 60s and had been members for a good many years. In contrast, the women were fairly new and were in their late 30s or early 40s. At best, the male board members tolerated the newcomers, but bristled at their inevitable challenges to their traditions. That's the way we've always done things. That's the way we're always going to do things. No discussion. One of the women on the board was an attorney, and she was constantly questioning decisions and reports. I remember one meeting in particular that got quite contentious. Finally, the board president sat back in his chair and calmly opened his jacket so that we could all see his gun. This intimidated everybody except the attorney, who was not about to be intimidated by anybody. Since we were in an upstairs, unheated room in the middle of winter, I left that meeting shivering from cold, the tension, and the intimidation. 4 years later, I had gotten 4-H back to the fair and had worked my way into the job of chair of the fair committee and vice president of the board. Simultaneously, the board president and the executive director became terminally ill. So they resigned, and that left me in charge with 4 months to go before the fair. Somehow or other, we managed to pull the fair together, and it was a successful fair. So in 1992, the fair board offered me a permanent position. And that's how a city girl who was allergic to livestock became the first female executive director of the 169-year-old good old boys network known as the Monroe County Fair and Recreation Association. At that time, the fairgrounds did not look like a park. It was rustic. Is what I like to call it, was rustic. The town supervisor, who hated having the fair in his town, called it an eyesore. I took issue with that, although I will admit it wasn't particularly pretty. There were 5 buildings in all, 3 old metal buildings in the front of the fairgrounds that were mostly used for storage, and 2 buildings that were about a quarter of a mile from the county road. The main building was a 25,000 square foot domed arena, the prototype for many of the domed arenas that would spring up around the country, most of which have been wisely torn down. It was an unfortunate design for the Northeast. In the winter, the snow avalanched off the sloped roof and tore the membrane that covered the wooden structure beneath it. As a result, the roof leaked almost from day one, and nothing ever repaired it permanently. I'd like to read you a chapter from the book that I called That Damn Roof. I had a love-hate relationship with the fairgrounds. I loved the fair. I loved the shows we had at the fairgrounds. I loved the challenge of being in the event industry. The fairgrounds became my second home, and I embraced all the quirks that were inherent in buildings that were erected in the 1970s. The HVAC system was a constant source of frustration, as the whole system had been cobbled together from parts of the original ice-making equipment. The offices had no central heating or cooling, so until we got a new boiler system, we huddled around space heaters in the winter and sweltered in the summer. Although the heating and cooling system in the dome was somewhat spotty, what worked well was a ventilation system. It blew all odors directly into my office. This was especially evident when we hosted the Pet Expo. The smell of elephant dung is not something easily forgotten. Other odors bombarded me: manure from the livestock barn during the fair, mulch from the garden show, car exhaust from car shows, propane from the forklifts, and one day, a very strong odor of gasoline. My brain was somewhat foggy with fumes as I stumbled into the dome in search of the source of the odor. I found that one of my maintenance workers was trying to remove motor oil from the dome floor by using gasoline as a solvent. It was working, but the whole building was filled with gasoline fumes, and I had visions of it blowing up along with all of us. I ordered him to stop and to open every door until the smell dissipated. It was a freezing cold day in March, so the directive was not greeted with much enthusiasm. Since it was my first week as executive director, I'm sure my maintenance staff thought I was just being hysterical. But the biggest source of my frustration was that damn roof. As I mentioned previously, the dome was built as a prototype of the dome structures that became popular in the 1970s, but the design did not work in New York. The dome's roof was built with a wooden deck, swathed with foam insulation and covered with a neoprene membrane. Plexiglass windows, around the perimeter was a wooden parapet, also known as a Yankee gutter, which supported the opaque plexiglass windows that also encircled the building. The roof was built on springs so that it could actually move up and down as the weight of the snow accumulated on it. It was an engineering marvel. Too bad it didn't work. In winter, several things happened. Snow fell on the roof. Since the heat was on in the building and warm air rises, the internal heat began to melt the snow, which would then avalanche off the roof, tearing the membrane and wiping out the lightning rods that surrounded the roof. It sounded like an earthquake if you were inside the dome when the snow gave way. But the avalanche snow didn't just fall to the ground. Oh no, that would have been too easy. It accumulated on the parapet where it formed huge ice sculptures, like giant waves that pointed upward. This added a great deal of weight to the parapet that was not built for such. As luck would have it, most of those waves formed over the exit doors. Eventually, the snow would begin to melt and crash to the ground. We tried to keep the doorways clear, but it was a losing battle. I watched many exhibitors run for their lives as snow and ice cascaded around them. One year, we had an exceptionally bad winter with 2 major snowstorms in the course of a week. I had been on the fairgrounds for 10 years and I'd never seen anything like it. The roof flexed as it was designed to do, but it reached its limit. The snow load was just too heavy. My maintenance supervisor called me into the dome. The windows on the south side of the building were bowing outward because the load on the sagging parapet could no longer, was bowing outward. Bowing outward because the load on the sagging parapet could no longer hold them in place. We called a roofing company that brought in an excavator to remove the snow from the parapet. It was a dangerous job because the snow could avalanche and bury not only the excavator, but the excavator operator. I was at a meeting with a potential fair sponsor when the snow was being removed from the parapet. We had tried to get an appointment with this business for months, so there was no way I was going to cancel the meeting despite the inopportune timing. If we succeeded, it would mean a lot of money for the fair. In the middle of the negotiations, my marketing director's cell phone rang. He excused himself to answer the call, but returned a minute later and handed me the phone. My secretary was calling, and she was nearly hysterical. "It's bad. It's really bad, Fran. You need to come back," she shouted, loudly enough for the whole room to hear. Hysteria was not exactly the message that I wanted to convey to the potential sponsors, so I calmly explained that we had a roof issue with which I needed to deal when I returned to the dome. But my secretary was right. It was bad. In the course of removing the snow, the parapet had collapsed, causing the windows to tumble out onto the ground below. Now we had a real problem. With part of the support structure no longer supporting anything, we didn't know whether the roof was still structurally sound. That meant calling in a structural engineer who was flummoxed because domes were so rare that no one knew exactly what the load-bearing parameters actually were. After much angst, the dome was deemed safe and our scheduled gun show went off as planned. When the parapet collapsed, the press arrived at the dome before I did, having been called by a nosy neighbor who delighted whenever a calamity rose at the fairgrounds. I begged the newspaper reporter not to say that the dome roof collapsed, as it wasn't really the roof that was the problem, it was the parapet. But of course, the headline read, "Dome Roof Collapses," followed by derogatory comments from the town supervisor and code enforcement about the state of the fairgrounds. Despite the bad publicity, or probably because of it, the gun show had its biggest attendance in history. The promoters asked if I could arrange for that kind of publicity before all their shows. With the roofing company's aerial excavation, the engineering inspections, the new windows that were anything but standard, and the rebuilding of the parapet, the bill for that little incident was exorbitant. So of course I submitted it to our insurance company, which of course refused to pay it because our policy didn't cover gutters. Reversing the directions I gave to the newspaper about not saying that the roof had collapsed, I argued with the insurance company that the parapet was actually not a gutter in the usual sense of the word, but an integral part of the roof system. It took months and several insurance inspections, but they eventually agreed to pay. So finally, we had enough money to get rid of the ugly plywood that covered the hole where the dome windows had been before. Thereafter, whenever we had significant snowfall, I had members of my maintenance staff go up in a bucket of the forklift and shovel snow off the roof. I have acrophobia, so this was a harrowing thing for me to watch, not to mention how it was for them to have to go up there and do it in the middle of a blizzard. But we never had that particular problem with the roof, with that damn roof again. Every time the snow avalanched off the roof and tore a hole in the membrane, the roof leaked at the site of the hole. Sometimes the hole was so big that it was like a waterfall, and we were constantly berated by angry exhibitors because of a leak that suddenly sprang up, dripping onto their heads or onto their exhibits. I hated getting those calls because there was nothing we could do to fix the problems until spring. Then the leaks would be repaired, but there would be black spots on the roof where all the bandages had been applied. I could never figure out why they didn't use white bandages, but they always used black. So finally, the roof was looking pretty spotty, so I decided that we needed to paint the roof. That was not an easy proposition. First of all, we needed to use a special kind of paint that cost $200 a gallon. Then the roof had to be prepared so that the paint would stick to the membrane. When all was said and done, it would cost $50,000 to paint that damn roof. We hired a painting company and they began work. One day I noticed that one of the workers was on the roof without a safety harness. As the surface was quite slippery with wet paint, he was having fun sliding down the slope of it. I yelled at him that he needed a safety harness, but he just shrugged and laughed. 15 minutes later, he fell off the roof and broke his arm. There's a law in New York State called the Scaffold Law that was enacted in 1895. It states that if anyone falls from a height on your property, you as the property owner have absolute liability. So even though the painter worked for a subcontractor who had workers' compensation, and even though he was required by his company to wear a safety harness that was attached to the top of the roof, and even though I had warned him he needed a safety harness, we were still liable and ended up paying him. That damn roof. So under the roof was the dome, two-story structure. The arena was on the main floor, and upstairs there was a large unheated, remember the unheated conference room, and two small meeting rooms. But the most interesting room upstairs was the chapel. The chapel had been sponsored and designed by the Projansky family. The Projansky patriarch was a well-known Rochester area furrier, and he was also on the board of directors. And he wanted there to be a place where people could get married regardless of their religious affiliation. The room was designed as a round room so that the devil couldn't corner you. It was a darkly paneled room, and since it was in an interior space, there were no windows, so it was really rather creepy. My longest tenured secretary refused to go in, and she was convinced it was haunted. Connected to the dome by a dark and narrow passage was Manette Hall, a 21,000 square foot rectangular metal and cinder block building. Both buildings had originally been built to be ice arenas, but the energy crunch hit just when they were completed, and it became financially impossible to run them as they were intended. The ice was never used in the dome and used for only a few years in Manette Hall, much to the disgust of the neighbors who never forgave the Fair Association for taking away their ice. The buildings were repurposed as event centers and were rented out for shows and conventions. They also became the primary buildings for the fair. I want to stop here and tell you a little story about the Fair Association versus the people of Henrietta. Shortly after I became manager, we received a land lease offer for a portion of our land for a soccer complex. The proposal needed to go before an open session of the town board, and as a representative of the Fair Association, I had to go to that meeting to show that the Fair Association was in favor of this project. I had been living in California when the dome was built, so I had no idea about the animosity that the people of Henrietta had to the Fair Association. Person after person got up, each person more vitriolic than the person before them. And I sat there thinking, what the heck have I gotten myself into when I said I would run this association? So I went back and I did some research, and I found that in the early 1970s, Barton Baker, who was a local attorney and educator, left money to the Fair Association for the purpose of building a youth education center. There was a stipulation in the will that said his estate would donate half of the money if the Fair Association would raise the other half. So they had a capital campaign, and the people of Henrietta contributed money to it. It wasn't nearly enough, and the Fair Association ended up getting a loan from the Empire State Development Corporation, and I believe it was like to the tune of $2.8 million. They proceeded to build the Dome and Manette Hall as ice arenas. An interesting side note is that Manette Hall bears the name of the attorney who brokered the deal rather than the philanthropist who actually donated the money. He got a little plaque in the dome. When the energy crunch hit and the ice was never used, the people of Henrietta felt cheated, believing they had contributed more money than they actually did, and they never forgave the Fair Association for what they considered a betrayal. Back to the description of the fairgrounds. Along the county road that ran in front of the fairgrounds was an oval, short, under a mile, motorsport track. In the 1950s, it was one of the premier stock car tracks in the country, hosting major national NASCAR races with race winners including Lee Petty, father of Richard Petty, Tim Flock, and Cotton Owens. But because of the residential buildup, the noise and dust from the track became problematic. In 1958, NASCAR hosted its last race, although weekly stock car races did run until 1961. Thereafter, the track was used only at fair time. This was a big deal, apparently. I wasn't around during that time, but apparently this NASCAR track was really a big deal. When the track was built, wooden grandstand bleachers were installed that seated about 7,000 people. It was my understanding that the bleachers were not new when they were brought to the fairgrounds. By the time I became executive director, some of the tiers had been demolished, and those that were left were at least 50 years old and built long before any of the current safety regulations were in place. They stood about 20 feet high. There were no backs to the seats, and there were large gaps between the rows of seats so that a small child could easily fall through the openings and off the sides or back. I constantly worried about this safety hazard, but our insurance carrier didn't seem to have an issue with it. Sometime in the late 1990s, we changed insurance carriers, and a risk manager came out to inspect the grandstand. It was about 2 weeks before the fair when our insurance agent notified us that the company would not insure the grandstand unless we made some significant improvements to it. What they wanted amounted to a complete rebuild of the bleachers to eliminate any gaps. This would not only be cost prohibitive, but there was no way we could accomplish it before the fair. After considering many options, none of which we had the time or the money to do, I hit on the idea of using snow fencing. We could staple the fencing to the bottom of each tier, the bleachers, and effectively create a safety net. We could also put it on the sides and back to keep people from falling off. I presented the idea to the insurance company, and wonder of wonders, they allowed it. That was the first hurdle. The second hurdle was finding enough snow fencing in the middle of July to accomplish the task. That was long before Amazon shopping, so we had to travel far and wide as we looked for stores that still had some snow fencing left. The third hurdle was getting enough volunteers to do the job. Surprisingly, that was the easiest of them all because I was able to get inmates from a nearby state prison. It turned out to be a fairly easy fix that took only about a half day and several cases of beer to accomplish. The orange fencing didn't look pretty, but it did solve the problem. In front of the grandstand was a 16-foot high safety fence that was designed to prevent debris and tires from flying into the grandstand during track events. After many years, the fence had rusted and looked terrible, so I decided to paint it silver, the color of most new fences. It looked great, all silvery and shiny. Unfortunately, the grandstand faced northwest, so when the sun started to set, it shined directly on the fencing. The silver color reflected the sun and completely blinded the people in the grandstand, so they could see absolutely nothing. Dealing with the complaints of an unhappy demolition derby crowd, mob, was not something I wanted to repeat. So the next year, we repainted the fence, this time using black, which was counterintuitive, but it worked, and no one complained, at least not about the fence. Behind the track was an outdoor horse arena, although the footing was not up to professional standards, and the riders never failed to complain to me about it. The rest of the 60 acres was used for parking. A creek ran through the fairgrounds, and on the other side of the creek was a beautiful wildflower meadow that was surrounded by trees and shrubs. Rabbits ran rampant through the meadow, along with deer and even a fox or two. Of course, since it was pretty secluded, it was also a lover's lane, a high school hangout, and a dumping ground, especially for used tires. Once we found a burned out washing machine. When we renovated the fairgrounds, we also found and plowed under a thriving patch of marijuana plants. But no one ever admitted ownership of that particular agricultural endeavor. And speaking of agriculture, I want to touch on that a little bit. Since agriculture is the primary purpose of having a fair, I was constantly being told that we didn't have enough agriculture at the fair. But that was okay because nobody was interested in agriculture in Monroe County anyway. The suggestion was made and continued to be made by my own board of directors that perhaps the fair should be abandoned. That drove me nuts because until all food becomes synthetic, people are reliant upon agriculture to live. So it sure helps if they understand a little bit about it. I went on a crusade to bring agriculture back as the focus of the fair, from attracting more livestock exhibitors to hydroponics displays and even to agriculture in space. I wish I could have convinced the Farm Bureau to participate more. They still felt that fairs were for farmers, as they had been in the past, instead of a place for farmers to connect with the consumers, an opportunity lost. Eventually, they did come around, but I wish that they had taken a more active role in the agricultural aspect of the fair. While I was executive director, we sold the front parcel of the land to Wegmans. This eliminated the 3 ugly metal buildings as well as the track. A new, smaller track was built in the meadow, sheltered by trees that provided a sound barrier from the noise of the vents. It was a perfect location, even if we did displace the rabbits. In 2012, after nearly 20 years, I finally decided to retire from the fair industry. I was 67 years old, and the financial and political stressors were causing my blood pressure to run amok. Still, I felt pretty ambivalent about my decision. Sometimes I counted down the remaining days with anticipation, and some days the thought of retiring filled me with dread. After 2 decades of working 60-hour weeks, what would I do with myself? Would my brain turn to mush? Would I become irrelevant? Would I obsess over dust bunnies and become a cleaning freak? Let's be honest, to be in the fair business, you have to be somewhat crazy. If you weren't crazy before you started, you were certain to be almost certifiable after 20 years in it. Every year, my staff, my board, and I would figure out what we wanted the fair to look like. Then we'd watch our ideas grow and thrive until they took on a life of their own, at which point we totally lost control and spent the rest of our time trying to keep our creation in check, sort of like Dr. Frankenstein. But that isn't what makes fair people crazy. The crazy part is that no matter how weird things get, fair people cue it all up and do it again the next year. Torrential rain, we spit at rain. Electrical storms that knock your socks off, ha. 95 degrees temperatures, don't be a sissy. That's either craziness, masochism, or both. Working for the Fair Association not only made me crazy, but both proud and humble. The people with whom I worked had an extraordinary emotional investment in the facility and in the fair, and everything we accomplished was the result of a superhuman team effort. As a small nonprofit, there was never enough money to do what we wanted to do, much less what was necessary. Yet the staff always soldiered on, finding ways to do the impossible with no resources and taking pride in finding solutions to the unsolvable. I was so lucky to have a staff like that. I saw our fair change from what was dubbed a sleazy carnival and an embarrassment to the industry into one that was considered innovative, winning state and national recognition. My biggest disappointment was that our fair's attendance did not reflect the change in our stature. Being a fair manager was not what I planned to do in life, but I think it was what I was always meant to do. Corky, our carnival owner, once told me that I was the heart of the fair, but I think it was just the opposite. I think the fair became my heart from the minute I stepped onto the fairgrounds. The events and the people that were part of my life for 20 years enriched me, taught me, nurtured me, and filled my life with purpose. I retired in 2012, and the year after that, the board decided to sell the fairgrounds to a real estate developer. which made me very sad. I always felt that we were simply custodians of the property and that we needed to protect it through thick and thin. To me, it was as if we were abandoning a sacred trust by selling it. With the sale, the fair moved to Northampton Park in Ogden, a town on the opposite side of the county from its previous home in Henrietta. This was an unfortunate choice for a number of reasons. To begin with, the largest section of fair patrons came from Henrietta. Traveling to Ogden was not something a majority of the traditional fairgoers was likely to undertake. The second largest demographic were people from the city of Rochester. Since there was no public transportation to Ogden from downtown Rochester, this effectively eliminated another group of fairgoers. In order for the fair to succeed in a new location, it had to attract a whole new audience, which is not easy to do. Another obstacle was that neighbors around Northampton Park were adamantly and vocally against having the fair in the park. This created a lot of very negative publicity for the fair, which was detrimental to the fair's goal of attracting a new and loyal audience. The fair board also decided to have an agriculture-only fair, not having a carnival and ignoring the hook and the income that gets people to the event. This also, as a result, the fair was very sparsely attended, even after the board eventually added some kiddie rides. After 4 years in Ogden, the fair moved again, this time back to the east side of the county to the Rush Town Park. The board hoped that, again, it would become the fair's permanent home, and they went into rebuilding mode. A fair can fail in 1 year, but it takes many years to build it back. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic presented another setback for the struggling fair. Like all fairs in New York State and most in the country, the Monroe County Fair was forced to cancel the 2020 and 2021 fair. There has not been a fair since then. I don't know what will happen to the Monroe County Fair. It has a proud tradition that has been in existence since 1823. It will take a dedicated fair board, hard work, long hours, and many volunteers to make the fair viable again. I sincerely hope that the board has the bone-deep commitment as well as the people power to ensure that this traditional piece of the American landscape will succeed and soar once again and provide an annual snapshot of our community. I have since heard, but I have been unable to verify, that the board has decided to permanently discontinue the fair and to disperse its assets. I hope that's not true, and if it is, I hope that there are enough fair lovers in Monroe County who want to reestablish it. So I thank you for your kind attention to me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So 4-H is still around. It's actually at the Cornell Cooperative Extension. Are they somehow could be involved in it, or do they have different events, right?
They do. Right now, the 4-Hers are going to other fairs in the community, rather because they don't have one of their own. Yes, 4-H would be a very good backbone for the fair if it were to be reinstated. But there's a lot of fences that have to be mended before that can happen. Yes.
You know, you mentioned the dome, and when we first came to Rochester in the 60s, it seems to me the RPO used to have their pop concerts in the dome. Is that right? Because
Yes.
we used to love going there. I assume the dome doesn't exist anymore? It was torn down, or what?
No, the dome does exist. It was purchased by Imbersia Development Company, and they still are having events there. I heard that they're going to turn the dome into a pickleball court. And I don't know whether that's true or not. That's the latest I heard from the DNC. But in fact, we did have an event at the Dome at Minette Hall just a couple of weeks ago. The Rochester Antiquarian Book Fair was there. So they are still doing events, but certainly not as many as they anticipated. And I don't know how they're going to pay back the tremendous loan that they had to take out, because they put, I think, $12 million into the renovation of the fairgrounds of the Dome and Minette Hall. And they haven't had enough shows to cover that. Yes.
Who was the architect of the dome?
I believe his name was Bishopine. And I think he's dead. Any other questions? Yes.
So, do you have any recommendation, right, so let's say, God forbid, the Monroe County Fair sold its last ticket. Do you have any recommendations about the fairs in the surrounding counties? That, you know, you would recommend as sort of substitutes for our.
Well, of course, the biggest.
So I was hoping you would recommend something like Orleans, Genesee, the two fairs in Livingston County, Ontario County, or Wayne County.
I've been, every summer, I've been going to a different fair to sell my book, because it's a perfect fair audience. And I've been to Wayne County and a Hemlock, Ontario. Where else have I been? Anyway, Hemlock Fair is a very nice fair. And they have a lot of good people that are really involved with it. I really like that fair. Wayne County is another one that I liked a lot. So I would recommend that you go to those.
So I'll just throw this out there, right? So Livingston County divided its fairs right into the Hemlock Fair pre-state fair and the Caledonia Fair post-state fair.
No, it's not post-state. They're both pre-state fair.
Well, the person that was running the fair, the Caledonia Fair a couple of years ago said that was her understanding of how it was set up. But the Caledonia Fair is not well attended. Would it be possible to synergize Monroe County with the Caledonia Fair?
You know, that was something that I had been kind of throwing out there, because we had a district meeting all the time with fair managers in our district, which is Wayne County and Orleans County. And I suggested, why don't we do a regional fair? Since all of the fairs in our region are struggling, why don't we come together and do a regional fair? But nobody was willing to give up their own little piece of the pie. So it was very hard to do that. Maybe now that Monroe County doesn't really have a place anymore, maybe now would be the time to suggest that again. I would certainly love to see something like that happen, and I would not be adverse to being part of that. It was part of my life for so long, and I really have a very close place in my heart for that fair. Any other questions? Yes.
There's so many festivals here, all the towns have their festivals, and Naples and the wine things that, I don't know if people would want to be making fair anymore.
Now, see, I heard that before. I happen to think that there's a place for fairs, because no other festival really brings all the things together that a fair does. And that's my feeling about it anyway. Other questions? Okay, thank you so much.
And as I said, if you would like to meet Fran personally, you're welcome to come up here. And the refreshments are in the back, and if you can sign up to bring cookies for our open house in December, that would be, we'd be very grateful. So thank you for coming tonight, and I hope to see you next month for the special presentation from the George E. Smith House. Thank you. Thank you. It's very interesting. Yeah, you're right. I did with the link. I was about, it is something.
It's very interesting. It's kind of like